Welcome to the Think Forward podcast, where we speak with futurists, innovators, and big thinkers. Come along with your host, Steve Fisher, and explore the future together.
Welcome, friends, and fellow big thinkers, to another exciting episode of Think Forward, where we explore the ever-expanding horizons of the future. Today's guest embodies the fascinating intersection of ancient wisdom and futures thinking. Imagine starting your career studying religious traditions, only to discover one of the world's leading futures programs is just down the hall in Hawaii. That serendipitous moment launched our guest on an extraordinary journey across 50 countries, from the UN's halls to humanitarians' front lines. He's revolutionizing how we think about and plan for the future through transformative foresight approaches that blend gaming, participatory methods, and cultural insights. As the UNESCO chair and former Global Futures and Foresight Coordinator for the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, he's made futures thinking more accessible and impactful worldwide. Whether designing immersive games to explore possible futures or helping humanitarian organizations prepare for tomorrow's challenges, he's passionate about ensuring all voices are heard in conversations about tomorrow. From his seaside home in Turkey, he works globally to help organizations and communities shape the futures they want. Today, we'll explore whether futures work is evolving into a full-time role or remaining a skill set, how gaming can unlock new ways of thinking, and why traditional strategic foresight just isn't enough anymore. Welcome to episode 125, Transformative Futures with Dr. John Sweeney.
John, welcome to the show.
Hi, welcome. Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
You know, for disclosure, I took a class that John taught on design futures, and it was absolutely excellent. And I think we're gonna dive in for everybody listening. But you know, many in the futures community know you through especially UNESCO work. But can you tell us a bit about yourself? Let's talk about you. What sparked your interest in futures, like in your journey?
Wow. Okay. Yeah. We'll dive right in with
Let's dive right in, man.
$54,000 question. Yeah. I mean, I always like to say that I guess professionally, I'm quite promiscuous, right? I've gone through many different kind of like phases or stages and identities. And so I guess that speaks in many ways to kind of my approach in general. I will say that like, actually, I always say like I won the lottery. Like I happen to be doing a master's degree in religious studies at the University of Hawaii, and randomly found out that one of the world leaders and one of the founders of the field of future studies was running one of the world's top graduate programs, one of the few places you could actually do graduate level study in this stuff, just like down the hall, right? Just around campus. And so I discovered this actually through a personal contact. She was doing a master's degree in alternative futures in the Department of Political Science. I said that was interesting. I gave up this whole comparative philosophy PhD plan that I had, kicked Japanese language to the curb. I met Jim Dater, and after talking to him for, 90 minutes that felt like 30 years, it was the only PhD program I applied for. I was fortunate enough to get in. Right when I came to Hawaii was actually when both Jake Dunnigan and Stuart Candy were just kind of leaving. So I had this insane attention from Jim Dater. And I had all the hallways filled with all of Jake and Stuart's work. And I was just like, I was like Willy Wonka. I was just like in the factory, like, whoa, like it was this surreal, amazing, nurturing, like I always feel like it was like a PhD Montessori. Like it was just go off and do and experiment and learn. And it was just the most generative and supportive and dynamic space that one could possibly imagine.
A lot to unpack there. First, obviously choosing to go to school in Hawaii, not a hard place to be.
Hey, yeah. So look, I mean, of all the life choices I've made, that's got to be in the top 5. Like I would say hands down, like going to Hawaii. Of course, look, you give up drinking orange juice because you can't afford it as a graduate student. It's too expensive. But like,
because everything's imported, everything's imported there. So
yeah. So the downside, of course, the downside of Hawaii is the islands actually only have an 8-day supply of food. If that container ship stops coming, even though it has a year-round growing season. I mean, Hawaii is a land of contradictions. Of course, it's an occupied space. Native Hawaiians, of course, are still struggling to, recover the kingdom. And it's a really tenuous situation in many ways, but Hawaii is a unique and beautiful place, and it has something really special. And actually, Futures is part of that story.
I remember there was a project on like the future of Hawaii. It was like 2050, I think, that there was like speculative futures. Were you involved in that at all? Or was that before your time?
So Jake and Stuart, and of course, headed by Jim Dater, did the Hawaii 2050, which happened in 2005. And what was actually quite interesting for me was all of the artwork and all of the stuff from that project were still in office. So I literally walked into the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies thinking that design futures, experiential futures was completely normal. And then 6 years later, in 2011, I was part of a group that did Hawaii 2060. And we did experiential futures in the Waikiki Marriott. We did LARPing and all this stuff, artifacts. So I literally from a very early stage, and that was 2 years after I started the PhD program, had this experience. So those were connected. We were meant to build off of the 2050 project. And that was kind of that early connection with the kind of design experiential stuff.
Yeah. And for those listening, Jake Dunnigan and Stuart Candy are pioneers in this field of, and I guess they could kind of coin the term of, experiential futures, which, I'm a design futures, speculative design. They're one of those kind of original group along with like Dunn and Raby and others, but, their work is fantastic. But it's interesting to hear you kind of building upon that. I think that speaks to the field itself, is that we build upon. It's like standing on the shoulders of the giants. Like you have to build upon. There's no bad methods or it's like things maybe have their time, have their application, and maybe it's time, which is, your work, which we'll touch on in a minute with regards to transformative foresight, is probably one of those, an excellent example of that. But you also got it, you said religious studies. What are you a theologian? Are you a pastor? Are you like a mom? Like what? No. Where did that come from?
Yeah. So it's not in any way related to, my spirituality or practice. I mean, I grew up Catholic, right? Which is a great way to be non-religious, I suppose. But I always had this interest from a very young age. I guess it was through figures like Thomas Merton, through kind of global spirituality. And I became really interested in East Asian Buddhism, when I was younger. And actually it was one professor. There was a faculty member at Kennesaw State University, which is actually now one of the larger state universities in Georgia. I did my bachelor's degree there, and I was 3 classes away from a degree in communications. And I had existential crisis. I gave it up. I took 2 classes, Intro to Philosophy and World Religions, and they were taught by the same faculty member, Dr. David Jones. And I was like, look, I put my entire life and future in this guy's hands. Turns out he got his PhD from the philosophy department in Hawaii. He was an unbelievable and giving mentor. And that led me down this other path. So I changed my degree, stayed in school for another 2 more years, a history of ideas and philosophy. And his message was, go to Hawaii. Actually, of his graduate students, I'm in Hawaii and did a degree. And that's why I was going to do philosophy, and then said, all right, I actually want to break. I want to dive into religion a little bit further. And that religion program is unique. It's one of the few programs in the US, certainly globally, where you can really focus in Asian religions. That's actually the focus of the program. Of course, they have Native Hawaiian, Pacific traditions as well. So I went there thinking let me ground myself in East Asian religion. Let me learn language. First it was Chinese, and then I switched to Japanese. And then I was like, all right, I'll go on and do my PhD in philosophy just across the hall. And then again, discovered futures and changed my life.
Are you a polyglot? You got lots of languages. You go to.
So I will say, unfortunately, I'm quite American in the sense I'm very poor in languages. I can say thank you in lots of languages, but I did a little bit. My Chinese is really horrific. I've forgotten most of my Japanese. My wife's from Belarus, so I do a little bit of Russian. I can say thank you in Turkish, little baby stuff. But I love impressing people just by saying thank you. So I try to learn the language of wherever I'm going. But also, I didn't realize I didn't answer the question. I'm fascinated with religion as an aspect of understanding people and what's important to them, and identity. And so for me, actually, knowing things about religion and culture, and that's been a superpower from a futures perspective, right? Linking up to values and identity. And so it's actually been a real asset. And I've done some work on the futures of religion. And there are subsets of futurists that do this kind of work. So I think it's an interesting niche, but I wouldn't say it's one of my like specialty areas.
It's interesting you bring that up because growing up Christian, and I still am, and more so now, grew up Catholic. I went to Catholic school too. So, but, studying other religions, looking at the impact of faith, and it's funny when I look at places, fiction stories like Dune or Foundation, right? These are 10,000 years in the future. These are like, millennia. Earth is kind of a forgotten planet that, but the issue of faith, when you watch like the Apple show, where is Jesus didn't really survive. It's like different planets have different faiths. They've even forgotten memory. The Dune, they have elements of it, of the Bene Gesserit, like they have this Catholic connection. They have like artifacts and some of the Bible and things that they do. But, it's like, what does it mean to have faith? What does it mean for a culture? When we think of futures, what does it mean to the identity and the belief systems that, and the value, like you said, the values that they then hold that make their futures? What are the probable futures or possible futures that, this is influenced by? I think everyone talks about tech. Everyone talks about economics. Very few talk about faith or values, which I think is, to your credit, an element that needs to be brought in because there's so much to the history of people, of the peoples, and not just the Western civilization that dominates. So what are your, how do you bring when you do like workshops or you work with, because it's obviously you can have a very overt conversation and probably easily offend people, but how do you bring those aspects into futures work when you do like workshops or exploratory work with clients?
Yeah, so it really does vary. I would say that, there are of course contexts where a client might see it as not being, relevant or useful. And for me, I might try to couch religion or spirituality within the context of culture or to your point around values, right? And
yeah,
I think I've also gotten to a point where I might say something like, if we want to understand people, then we need to understand the lenses with which they make sense of themselves and the world. And we can't do that without making, religion and spirituality and everything else in between. So I think for me, it's a natural part of trying to situate kind of not just what we see, but how we see it. And from the perspective of doing, again, the futures work that's going to have impact, I think that's hypercritical. And so I think some of the messaging there, especially again, maybe it's a corporate context or maybe it's a governance context where they think of a certain issue, right? Or maybe it's super technical, right? Like it's on the future of an energy transition or something, but like how people think about, again, those decisions they might make, incentive structures, right? The types of behaviors and locating that and relating that within the context of understanding, again, culture, religion, spirituality. I might call it different things, but to really try to get that root sense of what are people doing, right? Like, how is this affecting and shaping lives and what's important to them? And I think that's been a core part of the work, even if it's a one-off workshop, right? To try to bring it in some way. If it's a longer project, of course, maybe it's part of the scanning work that we do or something, but really try to get it at least on the table or on the menu.
So how is your understanding, as you said, you came into the Minot program for the PhD in 2015, and you've been in this field for a while. Like, what's changed? What's evolved over your career? What did you see in the field? Because I think it's more popular than it ever has been, rightly so, because of the uncertainty and the rapid change. I think it's a way for people to get a hold on things. But what have you seen evolve?
Yeah, I would say that there's definitely been this emergence. So actually, I started the PhD in Hawaii in 2009. And then it took me 9 years. I left Hawaii in 2014 because I had professional opportunities and had a growing practice. So that's why it took me 4 more years to finish. But I would say like in probably the last 10 years of really strong, like, out on my own, different relations, like, different types of professional practice, I've never seen it so widely and broadly just like out there. We're not at the level or degree of normalization, right? It's not, it's not a risk management yet, right? It's not a, it's not a whatever, like, right? But
cybersecurity.
Like,
it's not, the cybersecurity, it's not that common. Yeah. I get absolutely.
Yeah. Right. But like, I think we're getting like, it's becoming clear. And look, I mean, the honest truth is that there was unbelievable work that happened, up until December 2019. There's phenomenal amount of work that was amazing and impactful and powerful and great case studies and examples. But I think nothing has been more dynamically driving foresight than COVID, right? That was the wake up call. Certainly for a lot of the organizations that I work with, like the big INGOs, COVID was the elephant in the room, that thing that was like, oh, we should probably start formally thinking about the future. And if you look at, even quietly what's happened, new government foresight units popping up, new INGO, like, and you see it, the proliferation of toolkits and reports and everything. And like, it's quite clear that we're going to look back and say that was a watershed moment for getting the field up there. So that was one. And I would say also to your point, and kind of where we started or where we were chatting in the green room, was like this normalization of kind of games and design and experiential, like that's been an unbelievably like big shift. So I've been doing games for, again, 10 years or even like 13 years ago, we were doing mobile augmented reality, live action role play, like, experiential integrated stuff. And back then it was like, well, I guess we're going to, we'd spend more money on hot dogs and t-shirts than we would on like the open source mobile augmented reality platforms. But the point is now it's like, okay, people are open and into that. Like these are projects that are getting funded. And of course it depends on the client and the, the focus, but like, I'd say that the opportunity in the space to do that stuff, one, is still growing, but two, is becoming far more accepted. You look at the success of people, like yourself and Phil and Superflux and Jake and Stuart and others, like really the opportunity to grow that design experiential space is like, it's still there, but it's really taken off in a meaningful way. And of course, games. I do a lot of games as well. Like the game space has really exploded. At the Dubai Future Forum just last month, there was a whole special session with multiple games. Lonnie Brooks was there. Like it was phenomenal. Lonnie Brooks and Ahmed Best was there too. It was really, really cool to see all the games just kind of front and center in that space.
I'll cut this part out. So I'm good friends with Ahmed. He's going to be on the show. I didn't know. I know. Yeah, I know. He's a great guy. He's wonderful. You talked about, Dubai is a great space. It's been interesting to me that, and I believe that this is the decade to democratize this type of work. The question I have is, does this stay kind of a skill set, or does it become a real organizational role department? And there are obviously foresight departments, but they're fewer. There's usually like the futurist team of one, that evangelist, the one screaming, the crazy one screaming from the rooftop.
Yeah.
What do you think the decade ahead portends for the profession? Do you think it becomes more of this person is a futurist, or does it become like design thinking? You're not having design thinking departments, but you have a design department, right? You have people that are doing product design, right? They use these techniques. What are your thoughts on that?
Another easy question. Wow.
It's my job, man.
This is great because I think you really hit the nail on the head. Like so much of what I've seen in the last, 15 years and again, 10 years of like, really intense, like professional practice that fortunately has taken me all around the world is like, it's still very much about relationships and about personalities, right? Like someone is a diehard, someone keeps it going. Like you said, very few formal institutions that have a really long tenure. I mean, certainly there are longstanding governance examples, there are longstanding corporate examples, but you can count those on two hands. We don't have this like diffuse proliferation of longstanding, futures and foresight functions. And the one thing that's interesting to me is exactly at this moment where we're starting to see those things grow, the conversation around skills and competencies is starting to come back. I don't actually think, and this is where again, I maybe get in trouble, but and we were talking a bit about this before, not everybody needs a PhD. Not everybody needs a certificate, right? But you do need, if you want, I think, to meaningfully contribute to the conversation, realize, like myself, like everyone else, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. And so engaging and interacting with that, building a practice as a discipline, having, again, some of the theoretical, some of the applied, and being able to do that in a meaningful way, I think does contribute to work that has impact. And so we're seeing more trained practitioners get jobs. And that for me wasn't the case 10 years ago. Those jobs weren't there. And then when those jobs were there, they were filled by people who didn't really have training or necessarily experience. Now we're starting to see real jobs advertised, people with real training experience get those jobs. And it's starting to kind of mature. The one thing, of course, we want to make sure is it doesn't calcify, right? It doesn't I think this vibrancy of people coming at it from different angles, right? Like we were saying, some people come at it from design, some people come at it econometrics, some people come at it from story and narrative, that ecosystem, that ecosystem idea, I think is super critical and healthy. And we've seen this happen, right? The emergence of the experiential design. We've seen the discipline of anticipation explode in the past 10 years. You see futures literacy really reemerge in a meaningful way. Future studies is still continued on, but all of these things are now again, there's a lot of stuff bubbling. And so I would say I'm optimistic. It's a really exciting time. Of course, at the same time, the challenges of the work are still what they've always been, right? How do you create real, genuine impact? How do you leverage the tech to be able to do that? The tech is changing, of course, every day it feels like. So being able to use the tools to create really impactful, dynamic work is still, I think, the tall order at hand.
You said there's a lot of things in there. One comes to mind is the difference between, you think of it as tools, skill set, job role, a job function, right? Let's take Excel. Let's take Excel as a tool, right? There are people that you could just jump right in from day one and kind of use, but you can have training from it, right? There's a skill set to really getting really good at it. But then there's an application to it where it's you're a financial analyst or you're a business, designer. There's different financial model. There's all different ways that use that set. So it's we have obviously tools like scenarios or other types of engaged ways to do certain types of work. Then it's I think it's the gap. It's there's this the skill set itself, which some have taken on self-study or they've formally gotten it, but we have to make the leap into the different roles. And it doesn't have to be just futurist. I think that's the other thing is how do we define different types of foresight roles? Because it used to be just straight out. And the jobs that I see are very much entry level for the most part. They're looking for the signals researcher, the analyst, at least they're there. But at the same time, there are more senior experienced hires, right? But that's usually that person trying to build a team. So I think as we mature and the team matures, you'll need more, other experienced people at the same time. But it is something that I think we're going to have to, like you said, not to calcify it. We definitely have to at least get some kind of bounding for people to just understand it and how to hire it, how to buy it, right? That's the big thing. People don't even know how to hire it or how to write a job description.
100%.
So,
yeah, 100%. I'm amazed at how many times, even with well-known organizations, sharing TORs, sharing RFPs, really trying to reorganize, because as more people pick it up, and I think you hit the nail on the head, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that the commissioners of the work understand and are educated, because the last thing we want in this kind of massive, this Cambrian explosion of foresight is bad work to just proliferate, right? And then it's this isn't, it's not having an impact, or this isn't that. And so I think that's why, again, this attentiveness towards towards making sure that it's commissioned in the right way. And it's, always managing expectations, like what can and can't this do? And how can this be useful? And how are we evaluating this and measuring impact in different types of meaningful ways is always critical. And I think you also highlighted something else. Like there are lots of, and no shortage of those entry level jobs. A lot of times those higher level ones are tied to like a strategy or research or a policy thing. So that would be and that'd be great to kind of monitor and measure, right? When did those start to change, right? When do we see the chief futurist become the role, right? Like a C-suite, it's just a thing, right? And so if we see like an SVP of futures, like these types of things emerge, that would be really interesting to play with to try to like, as an emerging issue, like, okay, then we start to see a different type of scale emerge. That could be interesting.
There's two types of roles over the last 30 years, 40 years that come to my mind. One is the rise of the CIO and the rise of the VP or the chief design officer or VP of design. Is in the early 90s, it was just, IT, you just had IT people and running the mainframes, and then networking came. And for those, to give a history on IT, but in the early 90s, IBM was a big leader in this people were hiring the CIO and it was being pushed in HBR. And I'm sure all the consulting firms were pushing for this role to get it in there, but the CIO kind of started to emerge, right? And in two places, it was either, if it was under the CFO, it was like a cost function. If it was really reporting to the CEO, it was a strategic function. CTOs didn't come until the .com era. That's more the kind of fusion of strategy and tech. But that function, to your point, most people had IT managers or, VP. It was really getting through. Now CIO is everywhere, right? Same with design. You had designers living inside engineering teams and they just kind of make it pretty, which is the phrase, one of my least favorite phrases in the world, is then it became a design manager, a separate design group, and then it emerged. And then you started to have VPs of design. You still don't have you have chief experience officers, but it has emerged and it's kind of matured the same way. So I do think we're on that same path, and I do think it'll happen faster than those did. I think to your point about COVID, we saw the same thing at McKinsey. It was people overnight saw their supply chains shatter, everything they built for perfection. Just the idea, everything was now up in the air. The uncertainty was a way of life, and it's going to be for forever. I think, and AI even just exacerbated it on top of that. So everyone is trying to navigate all this uncertainty. So who are the best navigators of uncertainty? Futurists or foresight professionals, right? Because we look at all the possible futures. So a lot of strategy is like kind of more forecasting, like kind of extrapolate out. Maybe there's some things out there. They really don't deal in all the black swans. They don't deal in a lot of the too much of the what ifs, right? They just don't have time. And, they're measured on different things in terms of the performance of the business. So I think one strategy, I think it'll probably best reside in a strategy department or some type of parallel function where it becomes a really important arm. It's kind of like the engineering has the design group, like they have the leadership to make the experience because if your product sucks, no one will buy it. Doesn't care how great the code is. Same thing. It's like if your company can't navigate or at least see when things are going to change, no amount of strategy will help you. Right. So yeah. I love this discussion with so many different people because it comes to the same type of, at least some kind of common threads of it is evolving. It needs to be democratized. People realize it needs to be there. They're getting over it. There's one person that's like, I'm going to take charge and I'm going to form this group. And that's where you're seeing, like you said, we see at least the formation of entry level because they're trying to build the capacity. They're trying to build the team to put out some stuff because they can't afford. Maybe they don't need the senior people yet because it's just too expensive and it just the real doing that they need, right? So,
yeah. Well, I think so. You've highlighted, and I know this is where we were talking about going was like, let's say it does land in a strategy department, right? So a great home for quote strategic foresight, right? But maybe it lands in HR or like a SVP of culture or something, right? And so then it becomes like, how do we lead with the transformative stuff? And I know we're going to kind of dive into this, but like, I think like in different organizations, it can look quite different, right? It can have different homes relative to where it might fit. And maybe it is, again, still very relational and personality driven. Yeah. Until it finds a footing in a way that makes sense for that organizational culture or context.
Well, and this is a great kind of segue into transformative. So, I think it's a good primer because people always hear about strategic foresight, futures, but you have strategic foresight, and then you have also transformative foresight. So let's explain and do a little compare and contrast, kind of like, then let's do that first, sort of kind of lay the basis for people kind of in this conversation.
Yeah. So I think in the strategic foresight sense, like really rooted in, the work that we've seen built up over the past, 30 to 40 some odd years, where it's how do we have, forward-looking intelligence that has an organizational output or outcome, right? Like, so it's a strategy, a plan, a policy that is, insights driven, that is, again, is forward-looking, that is rooted in, of course, a range of data. I think to your earlier point, like maybe there is a real sense of we want to forecast and see what, X or Y year is going to be and have a sense of maybe where the puck is moving, so to speak, so we know where to skate. And I think that's, the strategic foresight that we've seen, talked about and thought about and really, become, I would say, a majority of the work that's not only performed, but certainly, wanted and commissioned. And I think certainly for me, like where I'm picking up the transformative work, and there's a great paper by Andrew Curry who talks about even within scenarios, kind of the dualistic thread of the field. So you can think of like, Herman Kahn and the work that was really, like creating scenarios as a term and like this kind of Cold War and coming out like as kind of the strategic foresight side. And then there was lots of people doing other types of futures work, in community levels, looking to different types of other, maybe wisdom traditions. And of course, more recently with the work of Sohail Inayatullah and, a lot of narrative foresight work and futures literacy is saying, all right, hold on. Let's look out. Sure. But first let's look in. Let's try to understand and make sense of the plural selves that we're using and bringing to these processes. I think for me, the one major difference, and maybe this is a bit harsh, I think the major assumption of strategic foresight is that we're just brains sitting in vats, that we're somehow not embodied beings that have feelings and fears and hopes. And so I think what I've found and why I'm trying to use this distinction a little bit more in my work and why I see others picking it up is it gives us a meaningful way to talk about those fuzzy perceptual aspects of doing this work that maybe aren't always as easy to work into, a proper strategic foresight project. So which is to say, like, how do we integrate images of the future, which shape how people think and feel about the future in meaningful ways? How do we deal with hopes and fears and narratives? How do we bring in the kind of mindset and the idea that, again, we aren't always seeing the future in one way because maybe we might fear the future as a parent. We might feel it different as a professional. So this idea of we need more complexity and depth and more ability to kind of touch on really the dynamism of who we are as beings in the world. And that's where the transformative has really been powerful. I do think it's rooted in lots of interesting different types of traditions. So I'm trying to locate it also in the work of people like Bruno Latour, who talks about matters of fact, which would be on the strategic side versus matters of concern on the transformative foresight side. I think to pick up what Sohail has talked about in metaphors, the strategic side is the hero's journey, right? We want to win the future. We want to get the idea and be successful and achieve X or Y. Whereas transformative is not the hero's journey, but the caravan. We're all in this together, right? How can we learn? The real product is the process. And so I think what I'm finding is that distinction is quite helpful, mostly because, and I know we touched on this a little bit, is there's an interesting overlap space where the transformative can be a supercharge for the strategic, and the strategic can make the transformative meaningful in an organizational way that maybe it wouldn't otherwise be. So I actually think it's that in-between space, that ecosystem of both, that's really a unique opportunity. And again, starting to see some organizations and even governments pick it up.
How do they, like, in terms of real kind of rubber hits the road, like how do they bring that into an organization? Is it, like you said, gaming? Is it workshops? Is it like because I feel like there's two versions of, there's the Foresight project. We want to do like future of X, right? We just want to have a futures come in, do some workshops. Hopefully just the report doesn't go in the drawer forever. But then there's the ongoing, like, active, there's lots of other activities. It's, more of a function. How does transformative work in that way? Because you're saying it's actually not by itself. It's really connecting to strategic as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the two major examples I would say, like I had a chance last year to be one of the advisors for UNICEF's Youth Foresight team, and they run a Youth Futures Fellowship. It's amazing work, and they contribute to the Future of Children report. Like, they do really awesome, meaningful work. At the Dubai Future Forum, they just had a major installation where they had personas, and all the fellows from all around the world came. And what they've been able to do in a really intentional way is integrate this transformative perspective into the process, the practice, and the products that they create at large. Is that they're really intentional and really trying to locate and root how they talk and think about the future with an attentiveness towards culture, towards power, towards understanding narrative, and having methods and tools that also support that type of reflexivity. I think reflexivity is really key, because again, it's not just this looking out, but how do we then look in relative to what we're seeing, and vice versa. And so I use this metaphor a lot. Like there's a great saying by Michel Foucault, who of course was this theoretician and talked a lot about power in his work, and where there are walls. And I love that saying, because when you put a window into a wall, John, of course everyone assumes.
John, you got cut off. Can you do the quote again?
Cut off.
It went choppy. So yeah, what's the quote? It's just kind of stir.
Yeah, so I love this. I love this quote by Michel Foucault, the French theoretician, who, talking about his own work, and again, he was always talking and thinking about power, said he's not a prophet. So again, he's not predicting, just like us, but he said that his job was to make windows where there are walls. And I love that, because it speaks to me to both parts. The strategic part is, you put a window into a wall, you can look out, but a window adds light into whatever room or space. So it changes the interior dynamics. So this idea of actually a window is a real two-way thing, of course, because, it can ambient heat or other things. So like this whole idea of like, you change the inside space through that practice of having that outward view. And I think that's this kind of in-between space that I'm really keen on through different practices, through different processes, through having products that speak to that. You can instill and create that reflexivity. Now, look, I'm not saying that strategic foresight doesn't have that, but I think, and again, to not be totally unfair, but if strategic foresight alone could have changed the world would probably be a different place. So we need to find ways to kind of enhance and strengthen that, and ultimately find ways to say, look, there are certain types of foresight that maybe we don't want to do, right? Maybe certain types of methods or tools have, their sell by date is gone, right? Like, so how do we find ways to always enhance what we're doing and to use, again, everything we can to help to create the changes that we want to see?
Yeah, it brings to mind, there's a chart of like all of the fiction or the work of speculative fiction or, science fiction. And it had like the utopian, dystopian, and the plausible, implausible. There's like very like one or two in the bottom of like the utopian, plausible type of thing. Like most stuff is dystopian. Yeah. We're optimistic as humanity. And I think your earlier point about this, like we like dystopia, but we believe in it's an interesting contradiction in the thing we call humanity.
But I was also thinking about your point about, it's going to come back to me. I'll have to cut this part out. I just had it in my head. Oh, damn. Man, can't believe I forgot it. It was a really good point too. I should have just pushed that out because it was how we apply. It was something about the application of foresight. Like, you talked about, strategic had been everything would be different now, but that'll come back. I'll have to just weave our way back. All right. So let me go back. So do you have like contexts or challenges that you feel like how do you choose the foresight approach? Like when you get into it, like what's like when you find is most appropriate?
Yeah. So I definitely go in now with a lot of framing around this kind of strategic and transformative. So even earlier in maybe even in an initial touch point with a client, I might kind of like, lead in with that a little bit to kind of give them a sense of how I want to kind of use some of this language. And for a lot of people, maybe it's new. So you're always kind of like, probing and testing and seeing, and you're always responding, of course, to a call, or it's an introduction. I do have my favorites, right? So like I definitely have my things that are, kind of go-tos. But I'm relatively agnostic with methods. Like I try to spice it up. I try to keep it fresh. I'm always trying to hybrid. I mean, that's led to new methodological things. It's certainly led to no shortage of kind of dead ends. But I would say that, scenarios continue to be a mainstay, even though I try to challenge or undermine that very traditional type of, scenario construct. So, certainly like the scenario archetypes, the alternative futures, whether it's Hawaii or Houston, I think get used. I'm a huge fan, of course, of causal layered analysis. The futures triangle has become probably like a go-to. And I always open engagements, whether it's a one-day workshop or a project with a polyg game. I love this idea that people have to kind of situate.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the polyg game was created by Peter Hayward. Peter Hayward and Stuart Candy have an article about it. Joe Voros is one of the creators as well. So it kind of comes out of the kind of Swinburne future school, if you will. And the whole work is based on Fred Pollock's work. So the idea of the image of the future. And of course, the book of the same name dives into the power that these images have and how they push and pull people. And basically, what happened, and Peter kind of tells the story, is that the game kind of emerged and said, instead of talking about it, let's play it. And so there's these two axes. So kind of running vertically is the idea of optimism versus pessimism. So again, are you happy or excited about the future? And then on the other end, right, are you the opposite, right, worried? And then there's kind of cutting across that to make this matrix is the idea of agency. Do you think the future can be shaped and changed? Or is there destiny? The future is determined or decided. And what you very quickly create, of course, are 4 different quadrants that are 4 generic perspectives on the future. Now, there's versions of the game. It can be run in different ways. I usually run it like this, where first people are thrown into one of the 4. You don't have a choice and you have to defend that. And then we kind of vote to see who had the best arguments. So it's very rational. It's very like, competitive. It's a game. It's kind of gets laughs. And then I completely turn it and say, okay, now where do you stand as an individual? And not just one of the 4, but the extremities, right? Are you dead center with a foot, in 2? Are you at the other end of like sometimes you do it spatially in a room. You can do it on a mural board. And so I try to create that kind of shift. So yes, we're looking out. Yes, we're kind of competitive. Then all of a sudden, wow, we're deeply personal. And for some people, it's quite vulnerable. It's quite disarming to have to share. I mean, I've had people where everyone in the room is in one quadrant, like in one corner, and one person is standing there saying, I believe this. I'm terrified, right? I'm worried about the future. And so it can create like that spatial element can create a really unique space to kind of open up again, that kind of more, that transformative, that perceptual, like, wait, how are we thinking and feeling about the future? And how does that shape what we think is possible, what we see, and how we make sense of the future?
Do you have an example where you kind of took these different approaches? Because you talked about how you start, like that really led to something like powerful outcomes. Like, can you kind of like anything you can like example you could share, like so people could kind of synthesize something direct?
Yeah. So the one example I use is I was really fortunate to spend almost a year as the Global Futures and Foresight Coordinator for the International Federation Red Cross Red Crescent, right? So world's largest humanitarian organization, somewhere between 11 and 14 million volunteers globally. Nobody really knows. I guess they can't count that many, 190 countries. And I was there at the start of their 10-year strategy process. And my job was to really kind of kickstart using foresight for that. And they had a strong innovation team. They had amazing people there as well. And we did this with different groups. And what was really interesting is we did this kind of internally with kind of the policy team. And you had kind of mixed, but you had more bias towards the kind of, the optimism. You had a lot of, perspective on the agency side. And we saw that really strongly with volunteers. Super fascinating. I won't name names, but some of the leadership were really entrenched into the destiny and the pessimism, which is the quadrant of doom. This is like the sky is falling. Nothing can change. Everything is horrible. And what that showed us was, as an organization, we had a gap. We had this unbelievable space to say, well, okay, what is it? And what is it about different countries maybe being located in different spaces? So that simple tool, using that almost like as a metric, as a guide to like understand what was the internal perspective or framing of the future, it really did bring a unique and interesting space to think about the types of, priorities, objectives that ultimately made it into the strategy. And so it definitely informed the conversations that were had about the types of engagements that we had. So we said, okay, this is interesting. Now let's kind of do this here. And so it really did open a unique space into how the organization was thinking about the future, and even some of the things that were unsaid. Because any other methods would have been about, this emerging tech or this emerging crisis. This was about how people think and feel, right? This is about what they actually believe. And so that space, again, really created a unique space to actually kind of surface some of those other maybe hidden anticipatory assumptions, other things that really were interesting to kind of bring out in a foresight process, in a very strategic foresight process.
So you've worked in well over 50 countries. So what do you see, like, these methods and the application of it, you've done a lot of work, not in the traditional, like I would call it Western civilization for, futurists kind of dealing with the US or Europe, but you've worked in over 50 countries. What are the differences you've observed in how societies approach futures thinking? Like because we talked about, say in the green room too, like values, we talked about religion, like those things obviously influence thinking and perspectives and just lived experiences. So what have you observed, like how they approach it or differences?
Yeah. Another easy question.
That's what I do, man. That's what I do.
It's, it's like a few things that like are more generalizable. But I would say like probably the one thing that I'm most I'm always interested in, but always trying to find that space. And again, I'm the perpetual outsider, right? So I think that's another thing to kind of like, I'm always holding that kind of space. And of course, a lot of times brought in as a strategic foresight expert, but I try to subvert that by always saying at the outset, like, I'm not the expert on the future of X. You are the people in the room. It's your lived reality. It's your context, organization, yada, yada, whatever. So anyway, it's a kind of like roundabout way of saying, like, for me, the most interesting moments and what's been interesting about working, again, primarily outside of Euro-American context is finding spaces where play, art, music, like more of those types of culturally rooted traditions can be infused or have a space in the process, so exceedingly powerful. And I would say like creates a different type of modality. Like people might come to a strategic foresight workshop, right? And John has flown to Bangladesh or Mongolia, and now we're doing it. Like it can be performative, right? They're there in their expert role as whatever, but they might not be there in that self as someone who lives in this community and, So I think those other types of like instruments or tools or whatever you want to call them open up a space where people don't just have to be that performative self. They can be that other self and bring that forward. And I think I've seen that happen, and that's been super powerful. And again, narrative and story can do that. It doesn't have to be art and music. It can be certainly the experiential and design stuff is there. Games, I love using those. So like these other tools, I would say are more impactful. And I've seen them be maybe even more widely embraced in some of those contexts. Now, with that said, I've done games with the European Commission, even in the US recently with a large government organization. So I do think that they are growing more normalized, but I would say that one major difference is that maybe some of these other spaces have a leg up with regards to using quote non-traditional methods, which I don't like that term, but like I think like if we say that the quote traditional narrative textual scenarios are the still the quote gold standard of strategic foresight, I would say the one thing is maybe in a lot of these contexts, there's an openness to the transformative piece, relative to some cultural and contextual dynamics.
Well, it's interesting you bring up, especially in the government side as an example, like let's talk about anticipatory governance. You think about the concept of that in policymaking. Do you have any thoughts on how that work has been influenced, like how that works with foresight? Can you explain the concept for people first, maybe? That would help.
Yeah, well, I'd say first off, like it seems like an oxymoron, right? Anticipatory and governance. Certainly,
right, exactly.
Like when we
Which
look
is why
at,
I brought it up, because it's such a weird term in and of itself, right? Yeah.
Yeah, well, it says a lot about our current moment if we think anticipatory governance is an oxymoron. But I mean, I hear this a lot, and I think given that it's not common usage. Now, I will say that a lot of this is kind of rooted in the earlier work that emerged in the 70s and the 80s, even some in the late 60s around anticipatory democracy, which was how do we infuse more forward-looking perspectives in these processes? So like, there was Hawaii 2000, which happened in the late 60s. There was Iowa 2000, which happened in the same time. So like, and really key people were part of this, right? Back in the day of the kind of like, all of the big names in the American kind of futures crowd or even globally. But this idea of how do we ensure that governance is not just being reactive, but actually fundamentally has a forward-looking component that is fostering learning, that is driving policy, as ensuring that people's livelihoods are fundamentally being, and again, not future-proofed, but in as best and as prudent as a way of possible, ensure that we're paying attention to the signs and the signals of these emerging futures. And I think most importantly, the part that I'm really interested in is how do we ensure that there is a space for people to participate in governance in different types of ways. And so I think it is about that collective intelligence, kind of leveraging that. How do we, and again, like having worked in participatory futures now for a few years, like ensuring that these processes are really enriched and infused with, again, citizen and resident perspectives to ensure that, again, we have governance that is taking more intelligence, more learning into consideration so that we don't have these kind of short-sighted policies. We don't have plans and strategies that are falling flat because they don't deal with the realities. And so I think it is about trying to make sure that this kind of, action learning mindset, and the work of Jose Ramos is great in this regard, to think about like, how do we make sure that governments are learning and really are action learning organizations so that they are able to kind of better meet the needs, not only of the president, of course, but to try to be more anticipatory with what those future needs can and could possibly be.
Do you think it needs to be infused? Because I was about to jump into, like, you kind of jumped ahead. It was like, how can large bureaucratic systems become more future ready, right? Do you need an Office of Strategic Foresight? Do you need I'm working on a project here in the United States that there's a group trying to put together the Office of Strategic Foresight, trying to make it a cabinet position. And that is compelling. It's almost like the National Director of Intelligence here in the United States. They kind of pulls together all the different, groups. So if you had foresight leadership in different of the agencies, and you brought something to kind of at least coalesce future vision, get aligned with overall, kind of an active center point, centralization. They love that in government. It's like, but bringing coordination to that, like, have you seen any systems that worked? Have you seen any organizations doing it? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, how they can do this?
Yeah, so I'm currently working with a government in Southeast Asia. At this point, I won't name the name because we're still emerging. The work is still coming out, but like, we are looking at case studies and examples for where this has worked really well. And there are some really great examples. So Singapore has a long-standing integrated foresight function that has really developed into a robust ecosystem. Finland is another really great example. And when I say ecosystem, that means you not just have one unit in one place, but like multiple functions that coordinate, that can talk to each other, that can even share informally learnings. People know each other. You also have people in educational spaces. You have academic, you have private sector, you have, civil sector as well. So like this idea of, again, a learning ecosystem that may be able to contribute to governance in a meaningful way. And again, I think sometimes that can be quite formal, right? Like plan, policy, strategy. Like you said, like a national intelligence function, like a high level thing. I'm really actually excited about a lot of this conversation that, again, back to our earlier conversation about what's changed. That conversation wasn't there 15 years ago, right? So like now it's come back. I mean, the US had the Office of Net Assessment was killed in the 90s, right? Like this actual unit that was kind of serving, right? It was in legislative, like it was meant to be like this kind of like looking ahead, like analysis, emerging issue, like that sort of a space. And that got killed, right? So the whole idea of bringing it and having a high level that people can look to, I think is really exciting. I'm also interested, and this is the other part of anticipatory governance we haven't talked on. And this is also where, let's be honest, this is like touching the third rail. We need new governance systems. We don't really have good functioning governance. So the one thing that's unique about Hawaii and the Hawaii Futures program, Jim Dater has taught for decades until, of course, his retirement, a graduate seminar on governance design. How do we design governance systems that actually integrate futures and foresight? And of course, he has a range of different challenges that governance systems face, but looking at different systems from different traditions and contexts, even looking historically. And then the capstone project is actually designing a governance system that deals with these challenges and certain variables. I had a chance later in my graduate studies to co-teach that class with him. And we even worked with architecture students as well. So like, it's a really interesting piece. And one of my priorities for this year is to kind of bring back governance design. Now, on the one hand, that's treason, because I'm saying we need to tear up, like in the US, let's tear up the Constitution and design a new governance system, right? So like it is this weird space of saying, okay, what does it mean to actually build governance from the ground up again and not just beholden to these things? I'm not saying everything has to go away necessarily, right? There's a lot of richness there. So like, but what does it actually mean to creatively and critically think about this? And of course, the Institute for the Future has the Gov Design Lab, and there's an amazing toolkit that emerged years ago. But like, to really be serious about
Jake Dunnigan is doing that's
exactly
his thing. So
yeah,
he learned it. He got it honestly, right? So from the data program, right? Because honestly, the PhD was a political science PhD, if I remember right. It's not exactly a strategic foresight. I actually think there's going to be a couple things. One, to address your constitution thing. You don't have to doing anticipatory governance doesn't mean like burning down the to me, it's just, let's just actually adhere to the Constitution. Can we look, it's in a it's an amazing document that's lasted almost 250 years. There's a reason it's got a lot. It's the execution of it and the bureaucracy. That to me is where the fruits of it lie. To actually put the things that we have in the Constitution and to live by that, I think would be a way to, and then how to effectively connect to the citizen to change that, or to make that they feel that they're part of that change, and also reduce the bureaucracy. It will be interesting to see the next administration, they actually do cut anything, but I'm not holding my hopes. I mean, it's a lot. There's going to be a lot of people that want things to stay the way they are, regardless of how you feel politically, or I don't care, but there's a lot of people that have a lot invested in the status quo. Right. And
yeah,
I think that's the biggest barrier in that, because if you get somebody who's a futures thinking and futures forward, they just want it to stay the way it is. They don't want to change, but until change hits them in the face so hard that they have no choice. Right. COVID. Right. So
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's what blew my mind is like, one of the things that comes up in Data's classes, and I know Jake's talked about this, and this is what got me like reinvigorated into the governance design, certainly for this year, is so the US is quite unique, right? The presidentialist system, right? The three branches, like the whole structuring, right? This Madisonian compromise that went into like the constitutional structure. It's quite unique. And what's interesting is if you look at every single government that has adopted that presidentialist system, right? So again, the US doesn't have a prime minister, power sharing is different, right? Parties aren't actually part of the Constitution. Long story short, every single government that has adopted the US presidentialist system, every single one, and we're talking about mostly like Central and South American countries, every single one eventually went into a military dictatorship. Every single one. So like so to your point is like, is there something about the structure? And I agree with you. Like if there are many things in there that we're quote abided by, right? Or if other, means and mechanisms weren't, mucking it up, like could look and feel quite differently. But, always these things have to be put in the context. And one of Data's points and why governance design to me is interesting is like, things are designed, as with certain, ontologies or worldviews and, assumed in mind, right? So, the type of worldview and the type of thinking that went into that document, which is unbelievable, still has insane shortcomings, clearly, but like was an unbelievable moment in human history, is still rooted in certain worldviews, right? And so like, what does it mean if we play with those worldviews, if we shift, if we open up and enhance that or start to tinker? And clearly the idea of a living document from a governance perspective is unbelievable. But that little factoid always stuck with me, like this military dictatorship kind of like looming out there in the horizon, at least for those again who have tried to copy. But it's I think a big thing that we're going to see hopefully come back to the table. Certainly globally, we have the need for governance in different ways. But even the conversation itself, I think that's the important bit, is like, how do we meaningfully have the conversation? And you're right, Jake and others have been on this for a while, and I think we need more discussion on it.
I was thinking about, because if it looks like it's directly impacting them, and they might be resistant to that, and there's people that can play those roles and personas if you do role playing, but at the same time, I think about the effectiveness of wargaming, right? That Booz Allen or other companies do with government agencies to kind of prepare them. I do wonder if the framing of it, because if it's that way, so that's the first, when we get to that part, because I wanted to ask you about other gaming examples, because we had talked about that as well. So let's from other people, like, so do you think wargame, do you think the messaging of it could be different in the anticipatory, so that they don't think that it's going to take their job, but it's going to help them, like, prepare, right? Prepare for change versus
Yeah. No, I think so. Like, I think, one of the challenges, like, and I think you hit the nail on the head, is like, we have a lot of systems that still very much have that kind of Horizon 1 managerial bureaucrat type of like control. And let's be honest, that's how systems remain stable, right? Now that presumes that the operating environment itself is stable. And yet like we see that we live that disjuncture. So why I love the games and certainly like I was recently part of a proper war game. Like it was this NATO thing and I got a chance to just be a participant, like kind of fly on the wall, play a little bit of a role. And I didn't design the game in any way, but that was the first time I'd seen like a proper war game. I do a lot more like with the poly game and these tabletop things, like, you know, or some immersive, like hybrid, you know, like live action role play or like mixed media type stuff. But like what I find is, and this is kind of back to the big picture, is like, I love Carson's distinction between the finite and the infinite game, right? The finite game is like Monopoly, like there is a winner, right? There's a scoring system. It's quite clear. We start and we stop. The infinite game is the game that we play to keep the game going. And I think that's that mentality of governance. That's that perspective on futures and foresight. You know, so many people have, you know, written and talked about this kind of framing. And I picked up Cars through the work of Zia Sardar and this now have integrated this as kind of a lens to make sense of what it is that we're really trying to do. And I think this also goes back to the strategic transformative piece. I think at the end of the day, the strategic foresight is like, we're going to play this finite game, right? We're going to, you know, some people talk about future proofing or winning the future. That language sometimes, you know, I have to grab the EpiPen. Like I have this allergic reaction. Like I'm like, we think just when we think we've won, right? Is like dun, dun, dun. Like, no, the future comes back and bites us. Like, so this idea of the infinite game is, hey, the next surprise is just around the corner, but hey, strap in, let's go. Right. Like this idea of like the idea is to keep the game going. And I think that's the part that like really at the end of the day does give me some semblance of hope, is like, what role do we play, or how can we then constructively keep the future plural? And I think that's a space that we need more ways to find the work that can get us there. And that messaging is critical as well. So that was kind of a roundabout way of coming back to games, but that's usually my landing for the games, is like, how do we ensure that we always have that futures plural perspective and use games as a means to be able to kind of bring that forward. So to your earlier point about the war games, so the uncertainty can be dealt with in a meaningful way, because a lot of times if the uncertainty can't be dealt with, then it's just thrown aside. And it's like, oh, well, we'll do this or that. But like, wait, what about the, like, no, we can't process. So like, we're going to go here, we're going to go there. And so I think the game space is a really powerful space to be able to do that. And I love being able to play and bring that in as a modality of kind of using foresight.
You mentioned the Dubai Future Forum earlier. I want to maybe bring this into it. You mentioned our mutual friend, Ahmed Best, who's in that, and Lonnie they were teaching games. They do a lot of work at USC teaching storytelling, teaching filmmakers, you know, really kind of getting them into design futures. And they obviously he does a lot of Afrofutures work too, but it was like the disciplines of futures thinking as a filmmaker, as a creator. Do you see any application in that way that could go toward government, or maybe what did you see there? And then we can kind of jump from that.
Yeah. So actually like connecting with Lonnie and Ahmed at the Dubai Future Forum was amazing. We were actually part of the same games showcase where myself and Jose Ramos, who were part of the team that developed the R Futures game, which is the participatory futures game, were there. And Lonnie and Ahmed were doing the Afro Rhythms game. And there were lots of other game space. And so what was amazing to see and hear was the sheer diversity and range of how play was being used. And, you know, Lonnie and Ahmed brought this unbelievable energy to the space. And we're talking about how the game is not just about getting from, you know, idea A to idea B, but actually creating the opportunity for people to meaningfully change. And to your point, like, how do we have new stories that are rooted in different types of perspectives and traditions and cultures? And how do we call attention to often, again, those, the real kind of contradictions, the tensions, the power imbalances, the inequalities that, of course, certainly abound in our present moment, to ensure that we don't just simply keep replicating and reciprocating those into the future ad nauseum. And I think that's what's so powerful about their work. And also where games are a space to create and hold those tensions. I actually find I can bring content in and play with ideas just by calling it a game in a way that I might not otherwise be able to do because some idea gets kicked aside. So I think I kind of use it again as that kind of space to hold things, or maybe clients, it's a bit delicate where they're not kind of sure how to talk about it, or we don't even know what it is. So we have to kind of literally game it out. And I think was great to hear that message come from Lonnie and Ahmed about the real power and meaningful aspect of games and the narrative and story component. Creating those, but also helping people find their way to tell their own stories. And then finding ways of using play as a means to understand what the story could be. So those are bringing in that novel aspect as well, by a lot of randomness. So like using the randomness aspect of gaming as a core element, again, I think has been really powerful.
That's interesting because it makes me think like algorithms, right, would be great in certain parts of the world where it wouldn't work in others, right? And any type of gaming, or you could reframe it maybe, or there's the game mechanics themselves, and there's the content or the theme of the game itself, right? So could you, one thing I'll have to ask Ahmed, and we're going to do an interview soon, is ways that algorithms could be used in other parts. Like the mechanics of what they've done is great. It's like you have your base. Can algorithms be used in an Asian culture, right? Could you change the framing and some of the things to create Asian rhythms, right? Asian, like you can do, right? That's fascinating because it's all about that context, and which kind of, teaching people, like, especially anticipatory governance, you're doing a lot of teaching work, and I want to talk about education. And you worked with UNESCO as a chair. What do you think we need to educate people? Like, how do we educate them? Like, and with all the tools at our feet, all the tools, in front of us, what do you think we need? Like, what changes do you think we need to educate people?
Yeah. This is another big fish. I mean, I think like at the end of the day, like I'm really impressed with UNESCO bringing forward futures literacy as a key educational competency, like not having it be this kind of like, unique or this boutique type of, specialty skill, but like saying actually everyone, and even if you look at UNICEF's work on youth foresight, like, when we talk about the future of children, and certainly now, and even into the next year where they're going to focus on education, like seeing this as a core competency that everyone should be able to tap into, because, and again, it goes back to actually this idea of like, okay, we of course are taught history so that we hope not to repeat it. Well, that hasn't really panned out so well. So clearly we need the ability to, as you highlighted earlier, navigate uncertainty, confront the imagined futures that shape, again, how people think and feel. And also, and I like Riel's work, Riel Miller's work on futures literacy, talking about how it's understanding the role that the imagined future has in the here and now. Because certainly for children and for youth, like what's possible. I mean, when I was a kid, I never even imagined that this profession was possible. I didn't even know like this was a thing. And yet to kind of come back to Dubai, there, every school children, or all the school children go on a trip to the Museum of the Future. And so now they're introduced to this idea and walk through this museum of futures artifacts. So that to me is a grand social experiment. And UNESCO is saying, look, let's bring futures literacy to the table and try to have and find our way towards a forward-looking type of perspective, realizing again that we can never know with 100% certainty what the future will be. We never have the power to make it exactly how we want it to be because the world is a complex and dynamic place. And yet we can move towards better futures if we intentionally and critically and creatively, use everything we have to try to imagine, again, a better future. And I truly do believe that UNESCO is attempting that, which is a Herculean feat. I mean, we're talking about trying to make the world a better place. But again, if this is what it starts to look like And this is nothing short of a generational scale shift, right? I mean, this is trying to ensure that just like we saw, different types of literacy emerge, over the course of human history. This is a new type of literacy. And I like that metaphor, like the idea of literacy. Some people say, okay, it's too this, it's too that. But like, even Wendy Schultz talks about futures fluency, right? So like the idea that people can learn this, right? It's not rocket science. And like being able to have these competencies, these capabilities, like this capability-based approach, like, tools, the methods, the practice, the process, like integrating this, the mindset, all of that, I think is I'm really hopeful. And UNESCO is really trying to see this as something that it can lead and champion on, and is, again, supporting the global chairs network and ensuring that we have the access and the resources and really the support to be able to try to further this work, again, in different ways, in different places. And it not always is the same everywhere, but like wherever we can to make sure that this is at least on the menu, right? And gets on the table.
You mentioned the word, Wendy talks about, I talk about futures fluency, but if you use both words, literacy and fluency, literacy means you understand it. Fluency means you can communicate it and do it, right? They both need to be there. There needs to be a literacy level, right? And then there's a fluency level, just like language, right? It is a language. Futures is a language itself. We covered a lot of ground today. And one thing I kind of want to, as we, get into one of my favorite topics is, ethics, as this changes. And also I don't really like the word inclusive because I think it's just been abused as a term, but, how do we make sure that, with the ethics of using whoever's in charge kind of controls the future, right? It's like whoever's running that thing, that's their future work that they do. Like, how do we work to make sure that it is inclusive? It doesn't perpetuate, kind of the status quo. I don't like to use any kind of like bingo buzzwords. I think there's a real challenge for us as futurists to do this. I think it's one of the underlying buzz of the whole thing. It's like we have to make sure that there's real effective change and that everybody's voice is heard, right?
Yeah. This to me is like, I go back to like the rootedness within the context that I feel of future studies and organizations like the World Future Studies Federation that kind of emerged during this Cold War era and said, look, like, another world is possible, right? There really is another world possible. And I recently, like, Anab Jain, co-founders at Superflux, right, talks about, other worlds are possible. So like, I think for me, the ethical is as a futurist, as someone who willfully identifies with that contentious moniker, right? Like a term is thrown around, like we were saying earlier on LinkedIn, but like to say like, it's really our job. It's really our calling. It's really like the ethos of what it means to be a futurist is to highlight that other worlds are possible and to do that in a way that calls attention to, the quote, the disowned, the disempowered, the disenfranchised, those potentialities and possibilities that are not just about, overthrowing the current just because that's what, the futurist does. It's the change and disruption. All of that is there. But like, how do we find ways? And this is, again, why I love the work of Sohail and Nirvana and others in this space of like, okay, we have the dominant, we have the disowned. What's the integrated look like? What does it mean to say that we have, this new type of structure that brings the best of both? And how do we find our way towards those types of futures? And then again, like, how do we keep the conversation going so that, the space of doing futures work. And I also, again, with John, like Zia Sardar had talked about, we don't just need imagination, to your point, we need ethical imagination. And he talks about then the virtues of ethical imagination as being humility, modesty, and accountability. And I like that combination because, okay, accountable to whom? Like, well, we're ultimately accountable as future ancestors. Like, we need to find our way to like this classical adage of like, leave only footprints. And we're not doing that, just like as happened previously. The humility piece comes in realizing like, we're not going to know everything. There's a lot of learning by doing along the way. And of course, the modesty piece is fascinating, because then what is it about the types of work that we need to do and don't need to do to I think the heart of your question, that is really critical within the field. And I think for me, that's always come back to the idea that in any project, in any process, how do I find a space to call into question those assumptions, right? To find a way to create provocations that can leverage multiple and different perspectives, and that can be part of the process. And I found that to be the work that, again, not just feeds the stomach, but really feeds the soul. And at the end of the day, that's the work that you want to try to find your way to do. And it's a constant challenge. It always feels like it's requiring that being in that middle space where people like you enough and think you do a good enough job to hire you, but also you have to make them uncomfortably uncomfortable enough to like, they're willing to like, wait, what's going on here? Right. So it's always that kind of like that fuzzy, weird space that, as a designer, like you're right. You're kind of always towing those lines, and sometimes you hit that wall, and sometimes the tree's clear and you open up in a field and like, let's go play. So like you have to, it's that constant type of wayfinding that I think is critical, that I think is at the heart of the ethics of doing this work. That I think is so critical and central.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's funny. On one hand, you'll hear, what data, there's different, I'm paraphrasing, but Sahile's like, if you're not thinking wildly enough, you're not really doing your job as a futurist. Like, futures aren't, and I kind of pride myself in, being a bit provocative, but I also am a realist. Like I understand, like, there's a limit to what people can consume or take at certain, sometimes you have to give it to them in small doses. Right. But as a designer, it's you brought that up, is like, if I'm paid to do a design project, if they're bidding it out, they have a better idea of what they want. Right. So there's a level of scope in that. It's the same thing. If you're doing a futures engagement, say you're doing something for their product and trying to figure out the product landscape 5-10 years to kind of look at, diabetes care always my go-to, because it's like, how much technology's changed with continuous glucose monitoring, or like, what's it going to be in 10 years? Like the evolution of that. Like, but if you go so far afield, it's almost like I can't design something too far, because then they won't accept it and the project will be a waste of my time. So I have to manage expectations, or I have to understand, really not just managing, but understanding their limits to creativity. I say, not everyone is creative. Not everyone is super and the limits, and there's different, I think, gradients of that. I think the same applies to futures work. It's like, I experienced that a lot at McKinsey, is that, that firm is paid a lot by people to tell them what to do tomorrow or the next quarter. The appetite for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, well, no matter your rate of change, most don't really care. Or they might put it in marketing speak for vision or other things. But the reality of action, it's the challenge now is finding those people that get it. But at the same time, I think shows like this and you teaching, like it's about getting the right people in those organizations to understand it so that they can buy it. Right. So that they're the ones that can communicate to their people to buy. Same thing with government, right? To those people that get it can communicate it to, the director of that bureau or the head of the minister of that bureau, that they have to do this. And they are the ones that usually kind of take their responsibility, take the heat. But I think it's important to understand that as a futurist, like what your client would really take as acceptable to live for, like a, outcome, with the understanding that some of it you may not like, and are you okay with that? Right.
Yeah. And I think for me, what goes along with this, and I think I feel like I've been fortunate enough to come to this, and clearly like you're also a living testament to this as well. Like we're also spreading the futures bug, right? Like, how do we get more people infected with futures? Bad metaphor. I get it, but like too soon. But like, like this idea of like, we want to create more people who are like, like whether this is high, low, or whether this is part of their formal work, or whether it's a thing they do at night and then bring to the office the next day, or bring to their, right? Like those people who are like, I'm going to do this no matter what, because this is part of who I am. And this is so important to everything. So I think that's the other part that I really dig about this is like when somebody clicks and they get it and you realize that like they've just how they see everything has just been completely shifted. Like there's a beauty in that moment. And that happened to me. And like seeing that happen in others is like, is what it's all about. I think that goes along with that, like other worlds are possible, this provocation space, like a bit of that. I think that's the critical part that is so central to actually having this great meeting.
Where I think it can be really successful for those who are listening is that if you find the levers with people, you'll find that they've been wanting to try and communicate this, but they didn't know how. And now this is an avenue and a pathway to actually synthesize something that could be consumed by people, the non-futurists, or at least to go toward futures literacy. The show here.
Yeah.
I like especially the insights of careers, this is not a common journey. It's no one's typical journey, like going to law school, become a lawyer, become partner. What's the one thing, kind of taking this journey, and you found this, what's the one thing you've learned in your career you wish you knew, like you would when you started?
Oh, that's a really, I guess that's a really great question. I think the one thing that as I look back is that I really needed to find that balance in myself of the extrovert and the introvert. Like I think maybe a lot of people have the impression by either doing this work or, trying to really connect that like the extrovert part is natural. And for me, it is in many ways because I really get so much energy from connecting with people and love that those moments of real connectivity and opening up and sharing and learning about others. And and on the other hand, like the need to kind of recoup and to recharge and to reflect and to go in. And I think for me now, I feel a lot of people, even people who I work with and in formal educational spaces, or even people who are like part of project teams coming to me and and talking about that balance. So I would say like having the ability to understand what that balance looked like. And it is, about mental health, but it is also about how we practice and what we do. Because the one thing I didn't realize when I started, and this is also about my own path, which has had a lot more precarity and maybe a lot more like moving around than others might have, is having that network kind of mindset, like having genuine connections and being able to work across different, organizations or teams or units, and like being open to that has really paid dividends. But that also requires lots of recharging, which is why I live in a small Turkish town and don't do any work in this country at all. Just like I'm here as like hey, we live by the sea and that's our life, because I need that. I need that space to kind of like recharge and kind of hold that. I need that keep, versus the other part. Right. And I think that's something that I didn't realize. I didn't realize how much of a weight or a cost there would be to doing this work. And so like coming to understand that and then coming to find a balance with that has been a really interesting part that would have been nice to maybe know in advance a little bit more, but the finding my way to it has also been, it's been a process, and it always is.
I can completely relate to that. When you think about the legacy we leave, right? This kind of looking back, we're both young, this field it's going to have an amazing decade ahead of it. And even more so, right? It's always, what if the singularity, right? Or what is the next 20 years, of life? There's always going to be a need for futurists in some way. But when you're looking back, you work with some great organizations. What impact do you hope that the work you do will have and hope it has on the world?
Yeah, I think now I've really landed on one thing that like is absolutely critical, that I want to feel like, look, if I've done this, for another 15 years or more, that like I can say I've contributed towards, and that is really keeping the futures plural. I think when I look at a lot of certainly the negative trends, right? The risks, the flashing neon signs that we all see and feel, it can feel a lot of times like we had discussed earlier, like the dystopic futures are winning, right? And we're headed off a cliff. Like I think a lot of people feel this way from, any number of things that seem to be converging. So if we can hold this idea that there are a range of futures that are possible, and that we have that as a mindset, this alternative futures mindset, and I've contributed to that in some meaningful way. They're working with X and Y, or corporation, organization, government, you name it. And I will have felt like I did something that was, like meaningful in this life. And I think also too, right, as a parent, like feeling like I've contributed to a world where my children have more possible futures, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that's of course what we want, but like to be able to do that professionally and to link that personal space into it is, again, it feels like it's, and I think, you've expressed as well, like it's a calling, right? You feel like, yes, there's a vocation, and yes, you can make this as a living, but like it's something more. And I think that's the part that like, I feel like, again, standing on the shoulders with others in the field of different generations, it's such a profound responsibility, and like it weighs heavy at times, but also like, wow, what a dynamic way to go through life, and hopefully to leave it in a better place.
I agree. It's a great place to wrap things up. We've been having a great conversation. So, John, thanks for being on. It's been a wonderful conversation. Can't wait to have you on again.
Been amazing, man. And I don't think there's anything else to say, but go Dodgers. Yeah.
Go Dodgers. Yes. For those that are listening on the audio, we both have I have my Brooklyn Dodgers hat, and John has his Los Angeles Dodgers. Like you stayed to the end. It's a Dodgers love fest. So, all right. Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Think Forward podcast. You can find us on all the major podcast platforms and at www.thinkforwardshow.com, as well as on YouTube under Think Forward Show. See you next time.